One October night in 1947, a syndicate boss put a $10,000 bounty on Bumpy Johnson's head and sent 3 armed killers into Harlem to finish it. They had the money. They had the orders. But within 48 hours, all 3 men vanished from Harlem without a single witness. So what exactly did Bumpy Johnson do that made Don Carlo Moretti beg for peace instead of blood to understand how it all came apart? We go back to the night the price was first set. Harlem smelled like wet asphalt and cheap tobacco that night. The rain had been falling since sundown. Slow, steady, the kind that soaked through a coat before a man even noticed. On Lenox Avenue, the neon signs bled color into the puddles. Red, yellow, a sick shade of orange that made the whole street look like something was burning underneath. Inside Floyd's barber shop on 131st Street, 6 men sat without speaking. Nobody picked up a magazine. Nobody cracked a joke. They just sat there, listening to the rain hit the window glass, and every few minutes one of them would glance toward the door like he was expecting something bad to walk through it. The rumor had arrived before the rain did. $10,000. That was the number floating through Harlem that evening, passed in whispers across card tables, muttered between pool shots, slipped into conversations the way a knife gets slipped between ribs. Quiet, precise, impossible to ignore once you felt it. $10,000 for anyone who put Bumpy Johnson in the ground. By 9 o'clock, every numbers runner on 125th Street had heard it. By 10, the bartenders knew. By 11, even the old women playing dominoes in the back of Miss Clara's kitchen had stopped their game to talk about it in low, careful voices. Frankie Numbers Caruso heard it at a poker table in a basement on 128th Street. Caruso was a thick man with small eyes and thick fingers that always seemed to be counting something. Chips. Bills. The odds on a situation turning ugly. He worked collections for a crew with downtown connections, which meant he moved through Harlem like a guest who'd overstayed his welcome but still held the lease. People tolerated him. Nobody liked him. When the number dropped 10,000, Caruso set his cards face down on the table and did not pick them up again. He looked across the table at a man named Delbert who drove trucks for a produce company, and he said, very quietly, "You hear that number?" Delbert said he had. "What do you think a man does with a number like that?" Delbert said he thought a smart man kept his mouth shut and his eyes open. Caruso smiled and said nothing else. But when the game broke up an hour later, he stepped outside and stood in the rain for a long time before he walked to his car. Junie Bird found out through a different channel. Junie was Bumpy's eyes and ears in the neighborhood, a thin, sharp-faced man in his mid-30s who dressed well and talked to everyone and remembered everything. He had the gift of being forgotten as soon as someone stopped looking at him, which made him extraordinarily useful. He collected information the way other men collected debts, and he paid it forward to exactly one person. He was at the bar at the Cotton Club Lounge when a waitress named Rosette leaned across the counter and told him what she'd overheard 2 men saying in the corner booth 20 minutes earlier. Junie didn't react. He finished his drink. He left a tip. He walked out into the rain and moved quickly toward a building on 133rd Street where Bumpy Johnson was playing chess by himself near a window. Bumpy looked up when Junie came in. He read the look on Junie's face and set the chess piece down carefully. A bishop. He placed it in the center of the board like he was marking a position on a map. "Tell me," he said. Junie told him everything, the number, where it came from, how fast it was moving through the neighborhood. Bumpy sat with it for a long moment. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand up. He looked out the window at the rain on Lenox Avenue. And his expression didn't change the way most men's expressions change when they hear their own price has been set. He looked, if anything, interested. How many people know it came from outside? He asked. Hard to say, Junie said, but it's moving fast. Faster than something local would move. People can feel the difference. Bumpy nodded slowly. He picked the bishop back up and turned it between his fingers. When a number like that gets into the air, he said, it doesn't just scare the target. It tempts everybody standing close to him. That's the whole point of it. They're not just buying a killing. They're buying the doubt. He set the bishop back down. I want eyes on every bar on Lenox and 7th between 125th and 140th, every numbers spot, every card game, every corner where Caruso's people collect. I want to know who's listening too hard and who stops talking when the wrong person walks in. Junie said, you think someone inside is helping it spread. I think someone always is. Bumpy said, the question is who and how deep. Outside, the rain intensified. It hammered the fire escapes and turned the gutters into rivers and made the whole street sound like it was under siege. What was later described by longtime Harlem residents as one of the most dangerous nights in the neighborhood's history had begun, though most people on Lenox Avenue that evening had no idea how close they were standing to something that would reshape the balance of power in New York. By midnight, Bumpy's people were in motion, quiet, careful, spreading through the neighborhood like water finding the low places. Every conversation was being listened to. Every name was being noted. The rumor kept moving. And Bumpy Johnson sat alone with his chessboard, watching the rain, and waited for it to lead him somewhere useful. Downtown Manhattan looked nothing like Harlem, 12 miles south and an entire world away. The streets near Mulberry Street were quieter, better lit, lined with restaurants that kept their curtains drawn and their back rooms busy after midnight. The men who ate in those back rooms wore good suits and spoke in measured tones and made decisions that other people carried out. Don Carlo Moretti was one of those men. He was 61 years old, heavy-set, with close-cropped silver hair and hands that looked like they'd been carved from something harder than bone. He'd been in the Syndicate for 37 years. He'd survived 3 internal purges, 2 federal investigations, and 1 attempt on his life that had left a scar running from his left ear to his jawline, a scar he never explained, and that no one ever asked about twice. He sat at the head of a long table in a private dining room above a restaurant on Hester Street. And across from him sat Vic Romano. Vic the driver. Romano was 44, lean, efficient, the kind of man who solved problems the way a mechanic fixes an engine, no sentiment, no hesitation, just an identification of what's broken and the fastest way to correct it. He handled recruitment for Moretti's crew when the work required outsiders, men no one in New York would recognize. The Harlem situation, Moretti said, cutting into a piece of veal without looking up, has been a problem for too long. Romano waited. Johnson runs that territory like it's a sovereign nation, Moretti continued. He pays what he wants, when he wants, on terms he sets. Every time we push, he pushes back. Every time we send someone to renegotiate, they come back with nothing, or they don't come back at all. He set down his fork. I'm tired of negotiating with a man who thinks Harlem belongs to him, Romano said. You want it permanent. I want it clean, Moretti said. No one from our crews. No one with a name anyone in New York knows. You find 3 men from outside Chicago. Philadelphia. I don't care men who have no connection to anything here. They come in, they do the work, they leave. Nobody traces it back. Romano nodded. Price. 10,000, split however they want it. Romano picked up his wine glass, considered it, set it back down. That number is going to travel, he said. Everything travels, Moretti said. By the time it reaches Johnson, the men will already be on a train. This account of the meeting draws on investigative records and historical reconstructions. Certain details, as with many underworld arrangements of this era, remain unverified. What Moretti did not account for, what men like Moretti never account for, because the architecture of their confidence leaves no room for it, was the speed of Harlem's information network. It did not function like a downtown network, where silence was maintained through fear and hierarchy. It functioned like a living organism, where information moved on instinct, through trust, through the thousand small loyalties that hold a neighborhood together when everything outside it is hostile. Vic Romano made 3 calls from a payphone on Canal Street before midnight. By the time those calls connected, Junie Bird was already sitting across from Bumpy Johnson, describing the rumor he'd heard at the Cotton Club lounge. The men Romano contacted were professionals in the specific sense that they had done this kind of work before and had not been caught. Their names were Salvatore Lupo, known as Red for the color of his hair before it went gray, a man from Philadelphia with 17 years of careful, quiet violence behind him. The second was a contract worker from Chicago named Doss, who spoke very little and billed by the job. The third was a local facilitator named Eddie Marks, who knew New York streets and would serve as their guide and contact point once they arrived. Romano told each of them the same thing: come to New York, check into separate hotels, make no contact with each other until he arranged a meeting. The job was straightforward. The target was one man. The timeline was 5 days. None of them asked questions. That was what professionalism looked like in their world, in the private dining room on Hester Street. Moretti finished his veal and poured himself a second glass of wine. He believed, with the full weight of 37 years' experience, that he had just solved his Harlem problem. He did not know that within 48 hours, the number 10,000 would be echoing through every card game and barbershop and corner conversation between 125th and 145th Street. He did not know that Bumpy Johnson had already heard it, and he did not know, could not have known, because it would have required him to understand Harlem as something other than a territory to be controlled, that the rumor of the price was not the disaster. The rumor was the first move in a game Bumpy Johnson was already playing. Moretti refilled his wine and talked about other business, outside on Hester Street. The rain was falling there too, moving north through the city, the same rain that was already soaking Lenox Avenue, the same rain falling on a chessboard near a window on 133rd Street, where a man sat quietly and thought about how to use the next 5 days. By the morning after the rumor broke, Harlem had changed its rhythm. It was subtle, the kind of change that wouldn't register to an outsider, but that every person who lived and worked in those blocks could feel the way you feel a shift in air pressure before a storm. Conversations ran shorter. People moved with more purpose, the usual drift of the morning men lingering on stoops, numbers runners making their slow rounds, the easy gossip that passed between shop owners opening their gates. All of it had tightened by several degrees. Bumpy Johnson had been awake since 4 in the morning. He sat in the back room of a dry goods store on 132nd Street that served, among its other functions, as a place where decisions got made. Charlie Doc Williams sat across from him with a notepad and a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Doc was a methodical man, former Army, former postal inspector, currently the person Bumpy trusted most with logistics. He had a gift for seeing a problem in 3 dimensions and mapping every exit before he walked in. "I need the Buick ready by Thursday," Bumpy said. "Clean plates. Nothing on it that connects back to any name we use. Park it on 136th. Driver's side unlocked." Doc wrote it down. "And if someone moves it, nobody's going to move it. I need it visible. I need it to look like a car that belongs to someone important who doesn't want to be found." Doc looked up. "You're putting it out as bait." "I'm putting it out as information," Bumpy said. "There's a difference. Bait implies I don't know who's going to take it. This is for specific eyes." He stood and walked to the small window that looked out onto the alley behind the store. The morning light was gray and flat, the kind that made everything look older than it was. "They sent 3 men," he said. "Outside men, nobody local. Nobody we'd recognize. That means they're operating off descriptions and photographs. They need landmarks. They need routines. They need someone to confirm what they're seeing." He turned back to Doc. "Which means someone in this neighborhood is going to be asked to provide that confirmation. Maybe they've already been asked," Doc said. "You think the contact is already here?" "I think the contact has been here," Bumpy said. "And I think they've been quiet about it because the number is big enough to make a quiet man stay quiet." He sat back down. "Change the Tuesday protection route. Move it to Monday. Different timing. Different sequence. Don't announce it, just change it and see who seems confused by the change. Close the 128th Street operation 2 days early. Tell the runners there's a city inspection coming. I want to see who asked too many questions about the new schedule." Doc nodded and wrote, "And get Junie in here." Junie Bird arrived 40 minutes later, slightly damp, smelling of coffee and cigarette smoke. He sat down without being invited to, and crossed one leg over the other in the easy way of a man who had been in this room many times. Bumpy told him what he needed. "I want 3 specific pieces of information moving through the neighborhood by tonight," he said. "First, that I'm nervous, not panicked, not running but nervous. That I've been making calls and the calls aren't going well. Second, that I've been seen twice near the Buick on 136th. Third, that my Tuesday night movement is unchanged. Same time, same route." Junie looked at him carefully. "All 3 of those are false." "All 3 of those are useful," Bumpy said. "The nervous part creates sympathy in the people we want talking. The Buick creates a landmark for men who need something to anchor their surveillance. The Tuesday route gives them a schedule to plan around. And when they plan around it..." Bumpy picked up the cold coffee cup, looked into it, set it down. "Then I'll know exactly where they intend to be, and I'll be somewhere else entirely." Junie left with his instructions and moved through the day the way he always moved, visible but unmemorable, present in the right conversations without appearing to steer them. By early afternoon, the 3 pieces of information were in circulation, not broadcast. Not announced, just placed carefully into the right mouths at the right moments, the way a card gets palmed and reappears somewhere unexpected. Meanwhile, Bumpy continued his public routine with deliberate precision. He appeared at his usual lunch spot on 125th Street. He stopped to talk with 2 shop owners whose businesses he protected. He played 3 games of chess at the back table of a restaurant on Lenox and won 2 of them. He was visible, calm, unhurried, a man who had not significantly altered his behavior in response to a death threat. This, too, was information, because 3 men had arrived in New York from out of town and were currently in separate hotel rooms in Midtown and Brooklyn, studying descriptions of Bumpy Johnson and waiting for their contact in Harlem to confirm his schedule, and what that contact would report, what the contact had to report, based on what Junie had placed in circulation, was that the target seemed unaware, that his routine was stable, that the Tuesday night route remained unchanged. A number of Harlem residents would later say privately that the whole operation had clearly been constructed days in advance, that what looked like reaction was actually preparation, and that Bumpy Johnson had understood the shape of the attack before the attackers had finished planning it. The Buick sat on 136th Street in the thin October sunlight, driver's side unlocked, clean and patient and waiting. Harlem moved around it like water around a stone, and somewhere in the city, 3 men who believed they were hunters were already, without knowing it, being guided toward a destination that had been chosen for them. Salvatore Red Lupo checked into a rooming house on West 46th Street on a Tuesday afternoon, paid cash for 5 nights, and told the landlady his name was Frank Corello from Pittsburgh. She didn't ask for identification. He didn't offer any. That was the arrangement. In places like this, a clean transaction between people who understood that some guests preferred not to exist on paper. Red Lupo was 53 years old, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something permanent and unreadable. His hair had gone fully gray in his 40s, the red long since drained out. But the name had stuck the way names do in that world, not because they're accurate, but because they're useful. He had worked contracts in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and twice in Boston. He had never worked in New York, which was precisely why Romano had called him. He unpacked a single bag, clean shirt, spare ammunition, a folded piece of paper with 2 addresses and a physical description of the target. He read the description twice, memorized it, and burned the paper in the bathroom sink. By Wednesday morning, Red Lupo was on a subway heading north. Eddie Marks met him at a coffee shop on 127th Street at 9 o'clock. Marks was local, a small, nervous man who knew the neighborhood and had been paid to serve as guide and logistics. He slid into the booth across from Lupo and ordered coffee he didn't drink and spoke quietly with his eyes on the table. "Target runs a standard circuit," Marks said. "Lunch on 125th, chess in the evening on Lenox. Tuesday nights he moves collections on a route that takes him along 7th Avenue between 9 and 11. Lupo looked at him. "You confirm this yourself?" "Word came through channels," Mark said. "Reliable channels." "I don't work on channels," Lupo said. "I work on what I can see with my own eyes. Take me through the neighborhood." What followed over the next 2 days was a careful, methodical surveillance operation conducted by men who believed they were invisible. They were not invisible. Harlem saw them the moment they stepped off the subway. It wasn't anything specific, no single detail that marked them as outsiders. It was everything at once. The way they walked without greeting anyone. The way they looked at buildings instead of people. The way they stood on corners a beat too long, studying sight lines with the particular focused attention of men who are measuring distance rather than simply waiting for the light. On Thursday afternoon, a woman named Cecilia, who ran a beauty parlor on 130th Street, told her afternoon client that she'd seen 2 men she didn't recognize walking past her window 3 times in 90 minutes. On Thursday evening, a numbers runner named Curtis mentioned to his supervisor that a gray-haired white man had been sitting in a parked car on 136th Street for 2 hours and had not gotten out once. By Thursday night, 4 separate people had passed the same information, in various forms, to people who passed it upward. By Friday morning, Junie Bird had a composite picture of all 3 men's movements mapped on a piece of paper that he placed in front of Bumpy Johnson at 7 o'clock. Bumpy studied it for a long moment. "They found the Buick," he said. "Wednesday afternoon." Junie said. "Marks walked Lupo past it twice." "Good." Bumpy folded the paper carefully along its original creases. "And they still believe the Tuesday route is live. As far as I can tell, Marks confirmed it to them twice." Bumpy nodded slowly, the way a man nods when something he expected to happen has happened on schedule. Meanwhile, Red Lupo was sitting in a different coffee shop on 125th Street, and he was watching Bumpy Johnson eat lunch. Lupo watched the way a professional watches without staring, without pattern, his eyes moving across the whole room so that his attention to one table was just part of a larger survey. He watched Bumpy greet 2 men who came in separately. He watched him read a newspaper. He watched him pay his bill and leave without hurrying. Lupo thought this man does not know he is being watched. This was the thought Bumpy had designed for him to think. The 3rd man, Doss, had taken a room in Brooklyn and came into Harlem only when Mark summoned him, which he had done twice. Doss said very little. He confirmed sight lines. He identified the alley behind the Buick's parking spot on 136th Street as a viable approach corridor. He said Tuesday would work and went back to Brooklyn. The plan was simple, because the best plans are simple. The Buick would move on Tuesday night. The gray-haired man who owned it, the target. The man they'd been watching, would be inside or near it. The alley on 136th provided cover for the approach. Marks would confirm the target's presence by phone 30 minutes before. 3 professional men. 1 straightforward job. 5 days of careful preparation. Some accounts from that period suggest Lupo sensed something was off in the final hours, that Harlem felt too quiet, too arranged, like a stage set rather than a living neighborhood. Whether that instinct ever found words, no one recorded. What the historical record does not tell us is exactly when Red Lupo first felt the specific discomfort of a man who has been hunting and begins to suspect, without being able to articulate why, that the animal he is tracking has known his location all along. But it was there, in the 2 quiet streets, in the faces that did not look at him directly, in the particular stillness of Harlem on Friday evening. The way a room goes quiet just before someone says the thing everyone has been waiting to hear. Lupo went back to his room on West 46th Street and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about Tuesday night for a long time. He told himself he was being careful. He was being led. The arrangement had been made 6 days earlier. Junie Bird had found Red Lupo not through surveillance or luck, but through a name that had surfaced in a conversation 3 weeks prior between a bartender in Philadelphia and a man who sometimes did work for Bumpy's extended network. The name was Salvatore Lupo, the bartender had mentioned, in the context of something else entirely, that Lupo had done contract work for a crew with New York connections and was said to be reliable. Junie had filed the name. When the $10,000 number surfaced in Harlem and the description of 3 outside men began to take shape through Bumpy's intelligence network, Junie pulled the name back out. He made a call through 2 intermediaries. The message was simple before any work gets done in Harlem. There are people here who would like to have a conversation. The conversation would be worth the man's time. More specifically, it would be worth $500 in cash, regardless of what decision he made afterward. Red Lupo, it turned out, had a debt. Not a financial debt, something older and more structural than money. Years earlier in Philadelphia, a man connected to Bumpy's network had helped Lupo exit a situation that would otherwise have ended his career and possibly his life. The help had been given without expectation of repayment, in the way that certain favors in that world are extended as long-term investments rather than immediate transactions. The debt had never been called in. Junie called it in on a Thursday evening in a parked car on a side street in the Bronx, far enough from Harlem that no one who mattered would see them together. Lupo sat in the passenger seat and listened. "We know the plan," Junie said. "We know the alley. We know the Buick. We know Tuesday. We've known it since Wednesday." Lupo said nothing. "We're not asking you to stop it," Junie continued. "We're asking you to change one thing, one detail, small enough that neither of the other 2 men will notice, large enough to matter." Lupo looked out the windshield at the dark street. "The approach timing," Junie said. "Marks is going to call 30 minutes before. We need that call to happen 45 minutes before instead. 15 extra minutes. That's all." Lupo turned to look at him. "That's all." "That's all," Junie said. "You walk away with $500. Your debt is cleared. And whatever happens in that alley Tuesday night happens without you having made any decisions about it." There was a long silence. A car passed on the street outside, and its headlights moved across the windshield and disappeared. "The other 2 men," Lupo said finally. "They walk in not knowing." "They walk in exactly as planned," Junie said. "From their perspective, nothing changes." Lupo looked at his hands. In his world, loyalty was the currency that kept men alive, not because anyone felt deeply about it, but because betrayal. Once established, followed a man everywhere and shortened his life by a predictable number of years. He knew this. He had known men who'd crossed the wrong people and watched what happened to them afterward. But the debt was real. And $500 was real. And the quiet. Certain way, this thin man in the driver's seat had laid out exactly what Lupo's plan looked like, told him something important: these people already knew everything. The decision he was being offered wasn't really a decision about betrayal. It was a decision about which side of an outcome he wanted to stand on. Some historical accounts suggest that more than one outside contractor changed sides during Syndicate operations in Harlem during this period, though specific identities were rarely confirmed and documentation remains limited. 15 minutes, Lupo said. 15 minutes, Junie confirmed. Lupo got out of the car and walked to the subway without looking back. Back in Harlem. Bumpy Johnson received the confirmation through a single word passed by phone: done. He was sitting in the back room on 132nd Street with Doc Williams when the word came. He wrote nothing down. He simply nodded and told Doc to have the positions on either side of the 136th Street alley filled and held from 9 o'clock Tuesday onward. How many? Doc asked. Enough that it doesn't require a count, Bumpy said. He poured 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Doc. He sat back in his chair and said nothing else about it for the rest of the evening. The trap that 3 men believed they were setting had been reoriented, incrementally and invisibly, until it faced the opposite direction. They would arrive Tuesday night carrying the full confidence of men who have done their preparation and know their ground. They would be wrong about everything except the address. Tuesday came in cold and clear. The October air had sharpened overnight into something with teeth, the kind of cold that made the streets smell like iron and wet stone, and the distant smoke of coal furnaces starting their seasonal work. By 8 o'clock, Lenox Avenue had thinned out. The usual current of evening foot traffic had slowed to isolated figures moving quickly, collars up, hands in pockets. Harlem was quieter than it should have been. Not empty. Never empty. Not on a Tuesday night, but reduced, as though the neighborhood had exhaled and not yet drawn the next breath. The bars had their usual sounds leaking under their doors. The numbers spots were open. But the corners were clear in a way that corners in Harlem were rarely clear. And the few people who moved along the sidewalks did so with the specific, purposeful walk of people who have somewhere to be and intend to be there quickly. Doc Williams was already in position by 8:15. He stood in the shadow of a delivery entrance at the far end of the alley behind 136th Street. A wide man in a dark coat, absolutely still. Beside him, 2 other men held the same stillness, the same patience. They had been there long enough that the cold had moved through their coats and settled into their bones, and none of them had shifted position or spoken in 40 minutes. At the near end of the alley, 2 more men waited in a recessed doorway. The Buick was parked at the mouth of the alley, exactly where it had been since Wednesday, driver's side unlocked, sitting under a streetlight that had conveniently stopped working the previous evening. At 9:17, Eddie Marks made his phone call. He called from a payphone on 125th Street, spoke for 40 seconds. Hung up. The message was the same message he had been prepared to deliver. Target confirmed near the vehicle. Route on schedule. Proceed as planned. What Marks did not know was that the call had come 45 minutes earlier than the plan specified. Not 30, a 15-minute deviation that he had not been told about because Lupo had not told him. Red Lupo received the call in a doorway on 137th Street. He passed the word to Doss, who was standing 20 feet away. They moved. They came from the north end of the block, walking at the deliberate, unhurried pace of men who know their destination. Lupo in front, Doss behind and slightly to the left, Marks falling in a half-block back to watch the street. The alley entrance was 60 feet ahead. The Buick sat dark and patient under the dead streetlight. Lupo turned into the alley first. He had taken 4 steps when the light at the far end disappeared. It happened cleanly. One moment, the ambient glow of the street behind Doc Williams was visible, and the next moment, it was not, replaced by the solid mass of a large man stepping into the alley mouth and standing there. Lupo stopped. Behind him. He heard Doss stop. Then the near end sealed. 2 figures stepped out of the recessed doorway and stood across the alley entrance, side by side, blocking the return path. No weapons were raised. No words were spoken. The 4 men simply stood at either end of the alley and waited. And the quality of their waiting, the absolute absence of urgency in it, the patience of men who have already won, was more frightening than anything that might have been said. Lupo turned once to look behind him. Then he turned back, in the center of the alley, 10 feet from the Buick's passenger door. Bumpy Johnson stood. He was wearing a dark overcoat, no hat, and he had his hands in his coat pockets. He was not holding a weapon that anyone could see. He stood with the particular stillness of a man who has been in this exact position before, not the position in this alley, but the position of total control, of having reduced a situation to its simplest terms, while the other parties were still operating under the assumption that the situation was complicated. He looked at Red Lupo for a long moment. Then he said, "You did the work. I appreciate the work. It tells me what I needed to know about the man who sent you." Lupo said nothing. "You came into my neighborhood," Bumpy continued, his voice level and conversational, carrying no particular emotion, "with a plan that was put together downtown by a man who has never spent a night in Harlem and doesn't understand how things move here. He thought money would make this simple. He was wrong about that." He took 1 step forward. "I'm not going to tell you what happens next," he said. "I'm going to tell you that nothing that happens in this alley tonight will be reported. Because nothing in Harlem gets reported unless I allow it to be reported. That's been true for 11 years. It's true tonight. No official report from the NYPD or any other agency documents the events that occurred in that alley, a gap in the record that investigators and historians have noted without explanation." The cold pressed down on the alley, somewhere above them. A window was open, and faint jazz came through it, a trumpet running something slow and deliberate, as though the music itself was measuring the silence between notes. Doc Williams did not move from his position at the far end. The 2 men at the near end did not move, and Bumpy Johnson stood in the center of the alley with his hands in his coat pockets, and waited for the situation to complete itself, the way a man waits who already knows exactly how the last move of a chess game resolves before the pieces have finished moving. Wednesday morning arrived the way mornings do, after something irreversible has happened, ordinary on the surface, altered underneath. The sun came up over Harlem at 6:41. The garbage trucks made their rounds on 131st Street. A woman opened her bakery on 8th Avenue and set trays of rolls in the window, the way she did every morning. Children walked to school in groups of 2 and 3, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. Nothing looked different. Everything was different. Frankie Numbers Caruso knew it the moment he stepped out of his apartment building on 129th Street at 7:15 and felt the quality of the silence on the block. It was not the silence of a neighborhood still asleep. It was the silence of a neighborhood that had already processed something and decided, collectively, not to discuss it. He walked to a payphone on Lenox Avenue and stood beside it for a full 3 minutes before picking up the receiver. He had 3 numbers to call. The rooming house in Midtown, where Red Lupo had been staying. A hotel in Brooklyn, where Doss had checked in under a false name. a cousin of Eddie Marks who served as Marks' emergency contact when Marks himself was unreachable. He called the Midtown number first. The landlady answered on the fourth ring. He asked for the guest in room 7. She said the guest in room 7 had checked out. He asked when. She said. Sometime in the night she hadn't seen him leave, just found the room empty when she went to collect the morning rent. He called the Brooklyn Hotel. The desk clerk said the guest in room 14 had not been seen since Monday evening and had left his key on the dresser. He stood with the receiver in his hand for a moment, then hung up without calling the third number. Caruso was not a man given to panic. He had been in this business long enough to understand that certain situations resolved in ways that were not clean and not explicable, and not something you pushed on if you valued the continued functioning of your body. He had learned this lesson watching other men push on the wrong situations and seeing what happened to them. He walked to a diner on 125th Street and ordered eggs and coffee and ate slowly and thought about what he needed to report and how to report it without making himself part of the problem. The disappearance of 3 contracted men from Harlem in a single night was not something Frankie Caruso had language for. It was not a shooting. There were no bodies, no crime scene, no investigation. It was not a flight. Men like Lupo and Doss did not abandon paid contracts and vanish without word. It was something else, something that existed in the category of events that Harlem produced periodically to remind the people who operated in and around it that certain rules applied here that did not apply elsewhere. By 10 o'clock Wednesday morning, Bumpy Johnson was at his usual table on 125th Street, having breakfast. He read the morning paper. He greeted 3 men who came in separately. He ordered a second cup of coffee and drank it slowly. He showed no sign of having spent any part of the previous night doing anything other than sleeping. This was deliberate, and it was precise, and it was the most powerful statement he could have made, not the events of Tuesday night themselves, but the absolute normalcy of Wednesday morning. The message it sent through Harlem was simple and total whatever happened. It required so little effort that it changed nothing about his routine. 2 women talking outside a pharmacy on 132nd Street spoke about the 3 missing men in voices, just above a whisper. A barber on 135th mentioned to his 9 o'clock client that he'd heard something had gone sideways for some people from out of town. A retired postal worker named George, who had lived on Lenox Avenue for 31 years, told his neighbor over the back fence that Harlem had a way of making certain problems disappear, and had always had that way, and that it was probably better not to ask too many questions about how the rumor moved faster than any newspaper could have printed it. By noon, the $10,000 bounty had essentially ceased to exist as a topic of conversation. Not because people had forgotten it, they hadn't, but because the number had been answered in a way that made further discussion feel unnecessary. The bounty had been placed. The men sent to collect it were gone. The arithmetic was not complicated. One person did ask questions. A patrol officer named Hendricks, working the 28th Precinct, had heard enough fragments by Wednesday afternoon that he opened a notebook and wrote down what he'd gathered. 3 male individuals. Descriptions uncertain. Last seen in the vicinity of West 136th Street late Tuesday evening. No witnesses, no physical evidence, no reports filed by any party. He wrote the word Harlem at the top of the page and underlined it once. Then he closed the notebook and filed it in the bottom drawer of his desk, where it remained until his retirement 6 years later. He never opened it again, though he would later mention the entry to a colleague in a private conversation, noting, according to that colleague's account, that some disappearances in Harlem during that period were simply not the kind of thing that a precinct report was designed to address. By Thursday morning, the Buick on 136th Street was gone. Nobody saw it leave. Nobody remembered who had parked it there. The space it had occupied was just a space on a street, indistinguishable from any other. Bumpy Johnson spent Thursday afternoon playing chess and winning 4 consecutive games against different opponents. Between games, he spoke normally about ordinary things: the weather, the numbers, a restaurant on 127th that had recently changed ownership. He did not mention the alley. He did not mention the 3 men. He did not, by any account from anyone present during those days, ever reference Tuesday night in any direct way for the rest of his life. A death produces fear. Fear has a duration. It peaks and then it diminishes as the immediate memory recedes and men recalibrate their sense of risk. But a disappearance produces something different. A disappearance has no resolution point. It sits in the imagination permanently, generating the same unease every time it's recalled, because the mind cannot close a story that has no ending. Harlem understood this. The old men in the barbershops understood it. The numbers runners understood it. The women who ran the informal information networks of the neighborhood understood it. 3 men had walked into Harlem carrying $10,000 worth of intention and had walked out of existence. No one who heard the story needed to be told what it meant. Don Carlo Moretti received the news on Thursday morning in the same private dining room above the restaurant on Hester Street, where he had given the original order 8 days earlier. Vic Romano delivered it in person, which was itself informative. Romano handled his communications through intermediaries when the news was manageable. When he came himself, it meant the news required a conversation that could not be transmitted through layers. He sat down across from Moretti without being invited to and said, without preamble, "All 3 are gone. No contact since Tuesday night. The rooming houses are empty. Nothing left behind." Moretti said nothing for a moment. He was drinking espresso, and he set the small cup down on its saucer with a precision that suggested he was controlling something that wanted to move faster than he intended to let it. "Gone how?" he said. "Gone without record," Romano said. "No bodies, no reports, no witnesses willing to say anything to anyone. The contact man Marks is also unreachable." Moretti looked at the table. He had the expression of a man performing internal arithmetic on a problem that keeps producing an answer he doesn't want to accept. "4 men, he said. 4 men. Romano confirmed. The room was very quiet. Downstairs, the restaurant was preparing for lunch service, the faint sound of a kitchen coming to life. Dishes, voices, the low percussion of early morning cooking. It made the silence in the upstairs room feel more pronounced by contrast. Moretti stood and walked to the window. He looked down at Hester Street, at the ordinary morning traffic of delivery trucks and pedestrians, and the city conducting its business with complete indifference to what had just been said in this room. "He knew," Moretti said, "not a question." "He had to have known," Romano said. "The operation was clean from our end. 3 outside men, no local connections, paid through 3 separate channels. Either someone talks somewhere along the line, or he has sources we don't understand. He has Harlem," Moretti said flatly. "That's his source. The whole neighborhood." He turned from the window. "Who else knows about this?" "The men who sent the contracts," Romano said. "Nobody below that. Keep it there." Moretti sat back down. He picked up his espresso cup, found it empty, set it back down. "I need to know if there's a path forward that doesn't involve making this worse." What followed over the next 48 hours was a series of conversations conducted in careful language between men who understood that certain situations required face-saving architecture before they could be resolved. The Syndicate operated on the principle that power, once projected, could not be visibly withdrawn, but there were mechanisms for quiet retreat that preserved the necessary appearances while allowing the underlying reality to shift. A journalist who covered organized crime in New York during this period later wrote in his private notes that a meeting occurred during this time between Syndicate representatives and an intermediary connected to Harlem's power structure. though he was careful to note that the location and participants could not be independently confirmed, and he chose not to publish the account during his lifetime. The intermediary was not Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy Johnson did not attend meetings like this. He did not need to. The events of Tuesday night had communicated everything that needed to be communicated, in the most durable language available, not words, not threats, not demands, but the simple, irrefutable fact of what had happened to 4 men who came into Harlem with hostile intention and were never seen again. The intermediary delivered 2 things. First, an accounting of what Moretti's operation had cost 4 men, $10,000 in contracted fees, and whatever additional value attached to the loss of face that came with a completely failed operation in a territory that the Syndicate did not control and had now demonstrated it could not easily enter. Second, a set of terms. Not punitive terms, not humiliating terms, something closer to a formal acknowledgement of existing conditions. Harlem operated under its own governance, collections, protection. Numbers, all of it ran through its own established structure. Downtown received its percentage through established channels at established rates, on a schedule that Harlem set. Any renegotiation of those terms would proceed through conversation, not through contracted violence. Any future contracted violence directed at Harlem's leadership would be answered in kind. The intermediary did not use the word warning. He did not use the word threat. He used the language of business, because business was the only language in which these things could be said without triggering the kind of pride response that turned manageable situations into wars. Moretti listened without interrupting. When the intermediary finished, Moretti asked one question. "Does Johnson want a direct acknowledgement?" The intermediary said no. Johnson wanted nothing acknowledged directly. He wanted the situation to proceed as though the previous 10 days had not occurred, which was itself the acknowledgement, the agreement to pretend, which was also the agreement to accept. Moretti nodded once. The meeting ended. On Friday evening, Vic Romano made 3 phone calls canceling outstanding arrangements. No explanation was given. In that world, cancellations delivered through Romano required no explanation. The $10,000 bounty ceased to exist as an active order somewhere in the space of those calls, as quietly and completely as if it had never been placed. Downtown had spoken. The language it had chosen was silence, which was the most complete form of concession available to men who could never afford to be seen losing. By the following Monday, Harlem had returned to itself. Not the tense, breath-held version of itself that had existed for the 10 days of the crisis, but its full, unguarded version. The Harlem that moved at its own rhythm and answered to its own internal logic, and filled the air with the particular combination of sounds and smells and human energy that made it unlike any other neighborhood in New York. The number spots opened at their normal hours. The protection routes ran on their standard schedules. The card game started when they always started, and the bars filled when they always filled, and the music poured out of the clubs on Lenox Avenue and onto the street where it mixed with the cold October air and became something that people walking past could feel in their chests. The Cotton Club Lounge had a full house on Monday night. A quartet was playing piano, bass, drums, and a trumpet player named Wallace who had been working that room for 3 years and knew exactly how to read a crowd. He played something slow and searching in the first set, something that acknowledged without naming the particular quality of the relief in the room. And then in the second set, he opened up and played fast and bright, and the room responded the way rooms respond when collective tension finally releases with laughter, with noise, with the specific joy of people who have been holding something and have been allowed to put it down. Bumpy Johnson came in at 9:30. He sat at his usual table near the back wall, ordered his usual drink, and listened to the music with the unhurried attention he always brought to it. 3 men came to his table at separate intervals during the evening: a numbers supervisor, a protection crew chief, a man who handled certain financial arrangements that had no clean name. Each conversation was brief. Each ended with a nod. Business was resuming. The mechanisms of Harlem's economy were clicking back into their grooves, reasserting the order that had been briefly threatened and had now been permanently reinforced by what everyone in the room understood had happened, even though no one in the room would have been able to describe it accurately in a court of law. Junie Bird sat 2 tables away, drinking slowly, watching the room. He caught Bumpy's eye once during the evening. Bumpy gave him the small, precise nod that meant everything was accounted for and nothing further required discussion. Junie turned back to the stage and listened to Wallace work through a long improvised passage on a standard, and thought about the particular efficiency of the previous 10 days, the way each piece had moved exactly where it needed to move, the way the whole operation had functioned like a mechanism designed by someone who understood that the most effective power is the power that never has to fully show itself. Doc Williams had closed out his end of the operation on Wednesday morning, quietly and completely, the way he handled all logistical conclusions without drama, without record. He had come to Bumpy's table on Wednesday afternoon and said simply, "Done," and Bumpy had said, "Good." And that had been the entirety of the debrief. On Tuesday evening of the following week, a young man named Darnell, who ran numbers on 141st Street, told his friend Marcus something he had heard from his supervisor, who had heard it from someone who had been present at a conversation he declined to specify. The story had already been through enough retellings that its factual core was surrounded by elaboration, specific details that may or may not have been accurate, dramatic flourishes that may or may not have been invented. But the core was solid. $10,000 had been placed on Bumpy Johnson's head. Men had come to collect it. They had entered Harlem and not returned. The price had been withdrawn. Marcus listened to the story without interrupting. When Darnell finished, Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How come nobody talks about it more?" Darnell thought about this. "Because he doesn't talk about it," he said finally. "And if he doesn't talk about it, nobody talks about it." This was accurate. Bumpy Johnson did not reference the events of October 1947 in any conversation that was later recorded or reported. He did not use it as leverage. He did not allow it to become a story he told about himself. He treated it the way he treated all demonstrations of his position in Harlem, as a fact that existed and required no narration, because narration would reduce it from something permanent and atmospheric to something episodic and finite. Stories about how Bumpy Johnson ran Harlem during this period survive almost entirely through oral accounts passed between residents, most of which were never committed to any formal record, a pattern that historians of the era have found both consistent and, in its own way, deliberate. A man named Elroy, who had worked in a barbershop on 133rd Street for 30 years, described it this way to a younger man who asked him about Bumpy Johnson in the late 1960s. 2 years after Bumpy's death, he wasn't the strongest man in New York. He wasn't. There were men with more guns and more money and more connections in rooms he never got into. What he was, and this is the thing that's hard to explain to someone who wasn't there, was that he was the most certain man in any room he walked into. Not arrogant. Certain. Like he'd already been to the end of the situation and come back and he was just waiting for everyone else to catch up. Elroy paused and trimmed the hair above his client's ear with the careful attention of a man who took precision seriously. "You put a price on a man like that," he said. "You're not buying a killing. You're buying a lesson. And the lesson is always the same one. It just costs you more than you planned." In the cold October nights that followed, Harlem moved through its rhythms, the way it always had, loud and alive, and conducting its own governance under its own terms. Watched over by a man who had just demonstrated, for anyone who needed the demonstration, that the neighborhood was not a territory to be bought or threatened or entered without permission. The $10,000 price dissolved into the air of the city, unreported, unresolved, answered in the only language that required no translation, and the music on Lenox Avenue played on into the dark, warm and relentless, filling the streets the way it always had, as though nothing had ever threatened to stop it. After that night on Lenox Avenue, no syndicate boss put a price on Bumpy Johnson's head again. Not because they forgot, because they remembered. A bounty was set. 3 men walked into Harlem. None of them walked out, and the man they came to kill went to breakfast the next morning and ordered coffee and read the newspaper like the whole thing had never happened. No guns, no announcement, no war. Just silence and the understanding that some neighborhoods write their own rules, and some men enforce them in ways that courts and newspapers never see. If you've watched this far, you already know this story isn't really about crime. It's about power, who holds it, how they keep it, and what it costs the people who underestimate it. More stories from Harlem's shadows are coming. Subscribe so you don't miss a single one. And before you go, tell us in the comments if someone came after you the way Moretti came after Bumpy. Would you fight back immediately, or would you wait and let them walk into their own trap? And which move do you think takes more courage?